Hi everyone, this is Social Free State and from socialfreestate.com, and I've got Jared here with me from greatorder.com. Um, Jared, do you want to tell everyone about yourself?
Yes, so I started thegreatorder.com and a YouTube channel about in the fall, early autumn of 2017. So I guess I've been at it about half a year now. And I think you commented on one of my earlier videos in October, and we've been in touch since then. Of course, I've heard your story and we've talked a little bit. So we wanted to have a conversation today. And since this is on Social's channel, we're going with the assumption that some of the people watching this are already familiar with the basics of her story, of your story, Social, a victim of migrant rape, and having to fight through the legal system and represent yourself, which is fascinating. So we wanted to use this conversation to talk more about some of the legalities going on in Britain, and then maybe segue into the working class as well. We have some questions, but the main thing is we just want to have a natural conversation. We've spoken privately before, and I'm sure this won't be the first time we do a stream, but being what this week has been in the UK, you know, obviously I can't help but want to start with this whole situation with Lauren Southern, Brittany Pettibone, Martin Sellner, their detainments. And one thing out of all of the material I've listened to around that, one of the things that stuck out was that they did convey that on the whole, they felt that the authorities, the police that they had spoken to were sympathetic to them and were mainly conveying that they were carrying out their orders, doing their duty, which dovetails with something I've thought for a long time. Because a lot of this is coming from the top, and then anyone in middle or lower positions, and this applies to not only authorities, but just your average person on the street, they're maybe not speaking out more because there's pressure coming from the top. So people are working against their better interests just because they feel scared of losing their jobs or social ostracization. Social, being that you have been dealing with the legal system, represented yourself to try to get compensation for the crime that you were a victim of. What I feel like this is just a good general question to start with. How does that strike you? What do you feel about what Lauren Southern, Brittany Pettibone, and Martin Sellner said about feeling like, on the whole, the authorities were sympathetic and kind of knew what they were doing wasn't totally on the up and up, but they're just pressured from the top. Did you sense something similar when you went through the courts and all the legal system that you've been dealing with?
Yeah, probably. I mean, less with my own case, but observing what's happened recently with regards to Lauren Southern and Brittany Pettistone and everyone. What I would comment and add at this point, which I think has been missed, is that last year, Amber Rudd, who deals with the justice system, um, she stated that there will be a big hard attack on anyone who is watching terrorist videos on the internet, and they want to crack down on those people and ensure that they are jailed for up to 15 years if they are caught watching terrorist videos. Now, the thing that interests me is that Lauren Southern was arrested for terrorism. That's particularly concerning because there's so many people watching YouTube videos. I myself turned to YouTube because I found that it was a great relief to hear regular everyday people, you know, um, disagreeing with the mainstream media. And that's something that, having been through something so politically incorrect like myself, I really needed to hear. So I think that a lot of people are going to be watching the apparent alt-right, and we're also going to be considered terrorists. And we face, now that she's been arrested for terrorism and detained for that, then that's deeply concerning to me, and it's not something that many people are talking about.
Yes, that is something I heard Henrik Palmgren from Red Ice talk about. That when some of these terrorist
Okay.
laws were being rolled out, he's been warning for a while that it's actually, guys, going to be used against the right. So watch out for that.
Yeah,
So
it
yes, I
is.
mean, this needs to come to the fore more. And yes, I was aware too and noticed that as well. That in Lauren Southern's story, she talks about how she was handed a pamphlet, and it was something about
Mm.
some law in the UK about terrorism. Um, but did you feel in your own experience that some of the people that you dealt with in the legal system were going through the motions or under great pressure from authorities on top of them? But was there anything kind of subtle or implicit? I mean, I know you dealt more with lawyers, what you call solicitors, over in the UK, but did you feel like people kind of know what's going on, but everyone is terrified to say anything, and this is just kind of seething under the surface in polite society?
Okay, with regards to the actual evening in which the attack was happened against me, the police were around when the perpetrator was acting aggressively towards me. In fact, they were in the car driving past, and it did, if memory serves me right, they did look over because I remember deliberately waving to them to try and get their attention, but they just drove onwards. And I believe that that's to do with stop and search and the preventatives put in place through legislation.
The PACE
And
law in the UK that you speak about,
yeah,
PACE.
that's it. That's Police and Criminal Evidence Act. I can't remember what year it was put. I think it was 1984, and
Yes,
that
it
was
was.
put in. Yeah, that was put in place, and with that, it means that there's stop and search, so that you can stop and search to prevent crime from happening, basically. And with the European law, so in 1998, we had the Human Rights Act put in place, and that meant that we had to all our legislation had to be was kind of undermined, if you like, by European law, and courts and legislation had to abide by the European Convention of Human Rights. And
Correct.
anything which was anything which was made before, any legislation made before 1998 didn't have to appease to these sorts of laws unless they were brought into court. But then more legislation was created after, and it was in 2010 that the Stephen Lawrence case happened. I think it was in 2010. But then it became a Race Relations Act, which enforced that there was no racism with stop and search. And obviously, what
Right.
happened to me happened after 2010.
So just to take it back for the audience. So this has been building. The 1984 law was a UK Parliament law. In 1998,
Mm,
there was more put into place from the EU, which, if I mean, we know we have Brexit going on now, but who knows what'll really happen.
yeah,
But being subject to EU law took precedence over UK law. So that begins to
that's
roll
it.
in 1998. And then, yes, from your videos, I've noted that too. In 2010, there was this minority status law. So a few things to pick apart here. But the first aspect is that for us in the States, it's the equivalent of quotas. So essentially, just to review for anyone that's not familiar with Social Story, what she's saying is that as she was walking home, she has this guy bothering her and following her, and a police car saw this, but perhaps because they'd already arrested enough people of a certain background that month, that quota,
Yeah, of an
they're like,
ethnicity.
well, we can't go bother with that because the police officers, they might face fines or penalties or go through their own police courts if it's found that they're arresting too many people of a certain background because they're then being racist. They're being charged with racism. So this is what I'm
Yeah,
starting to dub, this is unfair fairness, all in the name of this God of equality and God of fairness. People have to understand, those of us who criticize this, it's not coming from a hateful place, but anyone who's able to step back and look at this with some kind of logic, we would think, police need to be able to do their jobs. Citizens like social need to feel like they're protected, we have all of these roadblocks in place now that are preventing that from happening. So that is what happened to you on that night. You were perhaps a victim in a way, not only of this horrible man that did this to you, but of the PACE law itself, because of quotas, because of something put down on paper as a nice sounding, fair idea, had an effect on a real, living, breathing human being.
Yeah, yeah, I'd agree with that. And you articulate it far better than I do.
No, no,
I wish I could.
you're your videos and podcasts are wonderful, and I definitely suggest sometimes on Podbean, Social does podcasts where she'll speak, and it's a little more intimate or different. It's a bit of a different tone than a video, and not all of your podcasts are on your YouTube channel. So I've enjoyed
That's
listening to all of
true.
your material, and you're a great communicator and a warm communicator as well. So I'd certainly appreciate that. But getting to just when you were going through a few years after the crime happened to you, and you were again extraordinarily representing yourself in the legal system. And I know this
Mm,
is still going on, of course, and you give updates about this. But in that
yeah.
capacity, the people that you met representing yourself and going up against this tribunal and trying to get compensation, because in Britain, there's a way for victims of violent crimes to get some kind of compensation. Did you feel, as again Southern, Pettibone, and Sellner have been expressing, that there were people who were implicitly sympathetic and know something is amiss, something is wrong with this state of affairs, but they feel like their hands are tied, they're too scared to speak out? Did you see or pick up anything when you were going through the legal system and still are?
Yes, I think that I can say that I have done. I mean, the reason why I decided to, well, one of the reasons why I decided to represent myself is because I feel that although we're told that we have a right to a fair trial, I don't necessarily believe that that's true. I think we have the right to representation for a profitable trial. So I think also for that reason, it's in the best interest of solicitors or lawyers to not step on any toes or talk about anything uncomfortable. And I was determined to tell the judge that one of the reasons for the delays in my coming forward to the police was because I was too scared of getting arrested for racism because there are young children who are in schools who ask to be seated with English speaking groups, and they have been arrested for racism. And for me, it was
Arrested
so
for racism.
important. Perceived racism, yeah. They obviously didn't get sentenced, but even people acting angrily. There's a victim of the grooming gangs who I think they said some racial slurs out of anger towards one of their perpetrators, and they too were arrested. And that was the comment which the judge in my case actually spoke about. In my case in the tribunal itself, when I was representing myself, um, judge, I was very emotional. I will admit, I was incredibly emotional. It's not an easy situation to deal with, but the judge had great empathy for me, and if there was a situation whereby I was running through the reasons why I believed that I was at risk of getting arrested for reporting the crime to the police, and he was nodding, and he himself came up with cases whereby I would probably have fears of coming forward. So yes, I think that even judges recognise that victims are too scared to come forward, and
Yes, you're fortunate
I
you've had that judge. I've heard you speak about that particular
yes,
judge. And again, I
yeah,
want people
yeah,
to take a step back and appreciate this for a moment. That some of the girls who were victims of sex grooming gangs were afraid to speak out because of charges of racism, or as Social has related in one of her other videos, that there was, let me know if I'm missing any details here, but several years ago, it might have been way back in something like '06, if I'm not mistaken, there was a young child in grade school age, or at least what we would call grade school here in the US, who wanted to be moved from a group of students that she was with in a class exercise and a classroom activity because she was the only English speaker. We're talking about like 8, 9 year olds here. She's the only English speaker. Asks her teacher to be moved because she can't understand her peers she's supposed to be doing this project with. And something happened even to that girl on charges of racism in her school.
Mm, yeah. Well, she was 14, she was. But
Okay, so a little older
um
than I was saying. Okay.
yeah, but even so, it's those girls who were targeted as well, with the grooming gangs. If we consider the grooming gangs, how can these girls come forward about something so delicate and so politically incorrect to police when their school teachers are ensuring that they're arrested for racism?
So the
It's
14-year-old girl was arrested for asking to be
mm,
moved from a
yeah,
group because she couldn't speak, the other girls didn't speak English in her classroom.
that's right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Arrested and
So,
questioned.
not to put you on the spot, I admit on over on my side of the pond, I tried to do a little cursory research on this and not much turned up. Do you know
Right.
what happens if there's sentencing, if it moves forward in the courts of what happens when someone is quote unquote arrested for racism in cases like this? I know we have the Britain First people, Jada Franson and the other
Yeah.
gentleman, which maybe we'll get to, but in terms of more low level or not names in the media, anonymous people like this 14-year-old girl or other cases like it, do we know what happens when one gets arrested for racism in the UK?
No, no. I mean it. This kind of stuff, I don't know what actually happens within the legal system to them. Like you say, we've heard about Britain First, but they're high profile people as well. There's probably a lot of children and people who are getting lost in the system.
Right.
My own situation isn't really heard, and I've seen other grooming gang victims who are speaking out, and they have hardly any people following them, or you know, so we
Excuse
all
me.
get
I know
lost
the
in the
Rotherham
system.
girls are. Now we have Telford, of course, in the news. I mean,
Mm,
it keeps getting worse and worse and worse. But it's exposing again that I think that maybe there are low and mid-level people that somehow think that they're doing the right thing, and or are scared and too, you know, chained up in their own thoughts to speak
mm,
out, or they're afraid of losing jobs or social status. But there's too much coincidence, and it's happening in too many countries for me to believe that there's not obviously some kind of intentional way of chipping away at what we know and love of Western European civilization. And just to make a quick, because I know you have a wide audience, and I appreciate that. Just to make a quick aside about this term racism, neither I nor I think I can speak for social in in the classic or really understood in polite society understanding of that word racism, which to me in that context means just hating other people because they're different than you. Obviously, neither one of us is a proponent of that in any way, shape, or form. But when we see this word racism being twisted and turned and used in all these different ways where it doesn't even mean anything anymore and it's being abused, that is what we're speaking out against. So I just want to be very clear about that. But something that I really
mm,
like about your angle and how your mind works is that you're able to and conversations like this are increasingly happening in the US as well. You're able to look at existing laws and try to think about, okay, if this is the framework that we have to play with, how can people like us use it to our advantage? If other people are gaming the system, then why don't we be smart about things? And you're very vocal about making sure that people understand the law more. Something that you've conveyed in some of your videos and podcasts that fascinates me is that if you watch Arabic Muslim YouTubers or Pakistani Muslim YouTubers who are in the UK, in Europe, they know the law back and forward. It's like, oh yeah, statute 10A. And I mean, they know the law, which I think there's a lot one can say about that. I think it speaks volumes.
mm,
But you for example, you'll say something clever like this, some interesting angles, where you'll say something like the whole transgender thing, which to me, I mean, who's really transgender? Like 0.1% of the population. The whole transgender thing, really, one of the side effects of it is it could be a wedge for there to be a workaround for female genital mutilation going on in
Yeah, yeah.
hospitals. So I think when you say things like that, light bulbs kind of go off and it's very interesting. I want to relate that kind of clever way of looking at the law to again some of the things that hit closer to home that you've gone through. Like you have talked about how there are there's a minority status, and that since you were epileptic, you were able to use that as a minority status to some degree. Am I getting that right?
I don't think you'll ever meet a rape victim who's so grateful to have a brain tumor at the time they were raped. Yeah. I had a brain tumor at the time that I was raped, which meant that I'm epileptic. And that means that I fit into the marginalized group. So I become a protected minority because of that. Um, but of course, a lot of these, and what I also try to explain within my videos is that many of the girls who have become rape victims will also fit into that minority, marginalized, protected group because they will have gone through traumatic events which will cause them depression and post traumatic stress disorder and all of those sorts of things. And that is considered to be um, an ongoing health condition, and therefore it is under European law considered a disability. And for that reason, they become a protected class as well. But I'm not sure that they recognize that. I'm not sure that the girls who have been the victims recognize that they are a protected minority. And so, therefore, in the legal system, when they're fighting for compensation or for whatever it is that they're doing, they too should be protected in the same way that these perpetrators are protected.
Right, and that this is the brilliant kind of angle that I see you taking. And I don't know what your channels and networks are behind the scenes, but obviously it would be great to get this kind of information to these girls who are the victims of the sex grooming gangs and the people who are representing them. Because I know, again, under EU law, with some of the a lot of the things I've learned through watching all of your material is that there's this whole notion of the psychological harm of
Mm.
hate laws and things like that. And this is the precedent when we're talking about Sellner and Pettibone and what's going on. So the precedent is that this is the workaround on the other angle, that it's hate laws, and that people who might be of minority communities, although they're not minority in London anymore, but overall in the UK, minority communities, if they if it's shown that they're the recipients of something hateful, I think this is what was going on with the Jada Franson and the Britain First thing, that they went to guys who had been perpetrators in these sex grooming gangs and they tried to call them out. And then the UK authorities said, "Oh, you're calling them bad names, so we're going to put you in jail." So, that makes a lot of sense. Not to me as an American. But what I'm getting at is if there's this precedent of you can be the victim of hurtful words, then how can is it possible, do you think, to, as you were saying, kind of jujitsu this and turn it so that obviously the girls who are the victims of all this, they're suffering this tremendous psychological impediment as well. Why can't we use these laws that the EU has set up to protect the own white British girls? But again, going back to what we were talking about before, I would wonder, are there solicitors, are there barristers, for our US listeners, those would be lawyers in the UK, who would even want to take this up? That's the other concern.
Right. Well, it's interesting because when I had won the case, the tribunal case, and I had explained that in my own situation, I had been scared to go to the police for fear of arrest for racism. I explained, well, I had to get advice on the next part of the procedure, which was the tariffs. So I contacted a solicitors or a lawyers, and I asked them for help on that. And I told them that I had won the case, and I told them how I had won the case, and explaining this fear of racism. And they were shocked. They were bowled over that I had used that kind of language and confrontation, if you like, to win the case. They felt that it was something very clever, I guess, or something that not clever because it was very genuine, sincere. But it's something that they have said that they will use themselves in the future. Um,
Yeah, I mean, the what I was getting at with what I was saying a moment ago is essentially if we have EU human rights laws and they're being
mm,
invoked to protect Muslim and minority groups, how do we invoke those human rights laws to protect girls who are victims of sex grooming, or even in
I
broader senses,
I don't,
the general population who have the psychological harm of
yeah.
seeing their country slip away from them? I mean, that would be a harder case to make in 2018. But I think we have to think even more broadly than just the girls who are the victims of these sex grooming, although they would be an obvious first step because something more heinous and more tangible has happened to them.
Right. So I think that what's going on has caused a lot of societal, differences and unrest within our communities and our society as a whole. And I think that with that, inevitably comes depression. And I mean psychological depression. A lot of people are finding it very hard to live in our own communities, our especially in the working class communities. They've changed dramatically. And that will cause tension and stress, which will inevitably cause depression. And with depression, you will it's obvious that people will start acting with anger and in very negative ways. So I feel that one of the ways in which you can explain yourself in a court is that you can say, listen, I'm feeling really depressed about how society is changing. It's caused me depression. And I think that then you would become a protected class yourself, and they would have to consider things from a very different perspective. And I've been reading a book, and it's about how the law is written through Satanism, and it's by Michael L. Perlin, and he is American, and he deals with American legislation. And he discusses how the law is written up on the basis of Satanism, and these these studies are only done in America, actually, and they're only done every couple of decades. There hasn't been another update to the studies or um, legislation and mental health at all. But I think that if you've got depression and you are feeling in that kind of place, um, and you do something wrong, then you have to explain that to the legal team so that then you will become a protected class as you should do under legal rights, and they can consider then that you are dealing with mental stress, because intent is very different when you're dealing with mental stress and mental health. So
Mm-hmm.
that's something that we all need to consider,
Right.
and
And
we
and
need to
again, oh, sorry, please go on if you weren't finished.
I was just going to say we need to interrogate this part of society a lot more. How multiculturalism and the equality of multiculturalism is affecting psychologically the majority race.
Yes,
Or
what I was saying too, just to keep things straight for the audience, because it's a lot of information, is that again, consider what Social just said in light of what we said earlier in the conversation, that girls who were victims of sex grooming after the attacks and after it had come out, they might have said some slurs and they're in this heightened emotional state. But even so, because they said those slurs, they're getting arrested. So really, I mean, think if
Mm.
that's a kind of world you want to live in, if that makes sense. Now, something that I wanted to also clarify is that in some of your videos, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I've gathered when we were preparing for this conversation, I think that I'd heard you mention that certain aspects of mental health were actually not being brought up to speed in law books, and that
Mm.
you felt that certain loopholes in mental health definitions were actually again going to be used against people like us, because if you speak out against this, and you could be classified as a terrorist or you could be classified as deranged, there wouldn't be protections. And basically, if you speak up from a protectionist nationalist perspective, then you can be classified as someone who is suffering mental health issues. But then, because of being classified of having mental health issues, you're kind of locked away or put aside. But you also speak about using mental health as a boon to protect you. So I wasn't quite sure how to like surgically separate these things. Was your epilepsy, were you able to get minority status on epilepsy because epilepsy is more of a structural, functional condition in your brain as opposed to something that's a little less tangible and harder to touch, just like saying mental anguish? Because again, I'm just, I was a little confused because I've heard you speak about both. I've heard you speak about using mental health to protect people like us who have a more nationalist, protectionist bent. I've also heard you speak about, like I said, mental health being kind of ill defined in certain legal language and thus can be used to kind of just say anyone that speaks out is mentally unstable, so we're going to lock them up and silence them.
Right. Well, I'll explain my epilepsy and how it works with me. There's been a lot of research on my own particular epilepsy, and of course, everyone's is different. But I think it's relevant from a mental health point of view in what we're talking about. So rather than speaking up about what my fears or what my concerns are within life, my body deals with those stresses and those anguishes by going into seizure. So my in order for me to deal with all the mental problems which or concerns which are going on in my mind, my body just falls into seizure, and I deal with it in a very physical way in that certain sense. But then there are other people who will also deal with it in a physical way because they'll approach someone and start speaking out and you, in anger, whereas my body just deals with it in with a seizure in anger. Does that make
But
sense?
there's still a structural element because you had a brain surgery operation to address
Hmm.
your
Hmm. Hmm.
epilepsy. I asked because a close friend of mine, his brother also had it, and I visited him in the hospital, and he had the bandage on like you did, and I've seen it before, so I know there's structural
Yeah.
elements in the brain that they can help the wiring
Yeah.
and whatever the with the anatomy. But what I'm really getting at again is the legalities of this classification of mental disability. Um, so again, I've heard you say that it can be used, we can use it as a positive. I've also heard you say that it could be used against us. Am I right in saying, am I remembering correctly in some of the videos and podcasts you've done? I remember you saying that some of the legal language is actually a little loose and too open to interpretation, is what I felt you were saying, and that it could be used against us. Like, let's say I was in the UK and I spoke out a lot against what's going on, or you take a Tommy Robinson, they can eventually invoke some kind of mental health ordinance against him and use that as a way to silence him or lock him up or something. Was I gathering that correctly?
Well, I can't remember which one you're listening to. I know that in employment that I found it very difficult to find, with regards to epilepsy, and maybe with mental health you'd find consequences, certainly. I've done a video recently and I did a a blog recently about my concerns with regards to mental health, but that was more to do with the past. Can you identify which one it was?
No, I apologize. I don't have a name of a video.
Oh
I
yeah,
just know that I've heard different things about, like I said, using it for us, or it could be used against us, and we had to be, I guess we had to be aware that it could be a two-edged sword, this whole
yeah,
mental
yeah. It
kind of
certainly
thing.
could.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and that
yeah. It certainly can.
which is a good segue to the other big topic that I wanted to talk about, and I know is something near and dear to both of us, and something you briefly mentioned earlier. And that's how this relates to class and the working class in particular. You talk about stress.
Mm,
I've done some research, and you've also explained to me some things like 0 hour contracts, where a lot of guys who they work with their hands for a living. They're laborers, and they want to work, but they just are kind of sitting on call. And sometimes they're called for a job, and sometimes they're not. They work a little bit of hours here and there, but they don't have the long term steady income. They don't have the benefits. We've heard a lot of people speak about how hard it is to get on the housing ladder. That's something happening here in the US as well. But you've seen it in people who are close to you in your own life, that that's another form of stress. If a young man doesn't feel like he even knows how much money he's going to be making, or if he has certain benefits that will allow him to uh, start a family, get his own property, I mean, that's a tremendous thing too. And that's not, all of this is connected. This is a direct result of migration, first from other countries in Europe, which might have been a dress rehearsal for this, and now
mm.
even cheaper labor coming in from non-European peoples. I know there's a lot that we can unpack with that you've seen a lot about that. I don't know if you had any initial comments.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge wage war. I've struggled with this myself because I've worked self-employed. I left employment because of the consequences of, epilepsy and everything. But I
Consequences
worked
of what? I think
having
it cut out for a moment. Consequences of,
having epilepsy.
okay.
Yeah. So I've worked for myself, and I have found that whenever you work for yourself in self-employment, and then you have where I was living, there was a lot of different people from different cultures and also different nations as well, and everyone lives about 7 to 10 people in a house, in a small house, and I suppose when you're living in that sort of circumstance and you can afford to be very competitive with your pricing, you can even offer to work in employment for under the legal rate, and you can certainly compete against self-employed people as well, local self-employed local businesses. And I think that one of the consequences of this is that there's going to be people, natives living here, who don't find that they are financially secure in order to start their own family. And men aren't going to feel secure, and women aren't going to feel secure either in starting their own family.
So yeah, there is, as you were saying, there's a wage war.
Mm,
It started with people more so coming from Eastern Europe, more freedom of movement within Europe. And that's an interesting thing. I don't want to get too sidetracked. Maybe this is another conversation. But for anyone listening who is sympathetic to the whole, well, the white Western world needs to kind of band together, while there's certainly truth to that, I would still say that even if it was numbers matter, as you hear me talk about a lot, even if it's a tremendous amount of Polish people or a tremendous amount of Romanians, if they come into Britain and there's enough of them, they are, of course, more related, but they still have their own ways of doing things. They still have their own cultures, which, of course, we support. That's a beautiful thing. We like that. But
yeah.
if you bring all that into England and the wider UK, that's going to change things. But as I said, it also could have been a dress rehearsal getting the public used to this sort of thing. Because now, as you fascinatingly convey in some of your videos, you have non-European peoples who have come in, and as you're saying, they're able to work for even cheaper. You were
Mm.
priced out of your own independent business, as you speak about in some of your videos, because they can work, they can set their rates in whatever it is, whatever they're doing, so ridiculously low that there's no way to compete with them. And this is where we
We even have
see. Mhm.
Sorry, we even have human trafficking rings now. So a lot of the migrants who are here are not necessarily migrants. They have been they're modern day slaves, and they've been trafficked over here. And you will actually find that there are companies who make their items in the UK, and there's documentaries about this. They are made in Britain products, but when you actually research the factories, they are human trafficked people and migrants who come from very far away countries, and they are being enslaved into working here in Britain to produce items for huge brands in Britain under in very poor conditions, and they are modern day slaves, and it's disgusting.
Right.
You
So
know,
you have okay. You have non-British, non-European populations literally working clandestine under the shadows in factories in Britain,
mm,
a
yeah,
pricing out British people in the working class
and
who would
Europe
be
and
in,
European.
in these, and the Eastern Europeans who we were supposed to help to begin with.
Yeah,
Then we're buying back the products. I'm saying we like I'm British, but
by
you get what I'm saying.
slaves,
We're we're
by
we're
slaves.
buying back the products that our own working class has been priced out of, not able to make in the home
Mm.
country by people who are imported, who are working for slavery. This, people, is globalism. This is why you hear people
Mm.
like me talk about globalism. It's not this far off crazy conspiracy. We see very real, actual effects of it happening right here and now in the day and age we're living in, where there's no sense
But
of loyalty from the leadership class to protect their own people. The countries have been sold out. There's no notion of a nation, of all of us being in this together.
but Jared, the word globalism, I don't know if you realise this, but it's in Huffington Post UK, it was described, or globalist, sorry, it was described as an anti-Semitic word,
Yes, I
and
listened to your video on that.
that's
Yes.
that's being silenced as well. That word, all words which negatively, you know, you know, describe these people are being silenced.
Yeah, there'll be any kind of justification to silence any kind of criticism on this. But again, I
Mm.
just to think of the mechanism of this, because I know you have a wide audience from across the political spectrum, which is a great thing. Now,
Mm.
there's aspects of this that I believe transcends the left and right dichotomy, and it's not always useful to think in terms of that
Yeah.
left and right dichotomy. I mean, traditionally, at least in theory, I know that there's different ideas about how true this actually was, but at least in theory, the left was supposed to be looking out for the working classes. I mean, why we're pretty intelligent, pretty advanced societies. There's always going to be problems that come up and new challenges that each generation has. But with a little foresight, I really don't understand why, if the politicians were really looking out for people, obviously they weren't, I'm speaking hypothetically, but if they were really looking out for their people first, then they would be figuring out ways, okay, how do we employ our own people? Or if the population is down, how do we get our own people having more children? But when you see this cold, managerial, soulless way of looking at life and looking at humans as we're just all cogs, we're all units. You could take people from this part of the world, put them in a factory in that part of the world. This is what happens. It's destroying lives. And you've said you've seen working class men who, you talk about mental health. We could connect it to the mental health angle we were speaking about a few moments ago.
Definitely.
How,
Yeah.
the stress of not knowing how much money you're going to be making and if you can support a home and a family is tremendous. tremendous,
My
especially
goodness.
especially for a
I
man who wants to be able to provide for a
I
family.
I really feel for these men. I know personally these men who are being threatened, their jobs are being threatened, but if they don't, provide certain hours and all these sorts of requirements, they're threatened that, well, we can go for someone else who will do it for far cheaper. We don't even have to pay the full price. And these men have children, they have homes, they have mortgages, and I feel so devastated for them because of course a man wants to provide for his family. Most men do, and they certainly want to have a huge significant role within the family. So I feel that same devastation for them, and I of course it has something to do with their mental health. Of course it does. Yeah, absolutely.
The I know we've spoken a little about this privately. There's a stereotype that kind of comes over to this side as well, this side of the Atlantic, um, and it's about the chavs. I don't know how derogatory a term that is over where you live in the UK. Um, there's this stereotype that they have been like many other populations who are poorer, that they've been conditioned to expect welfare and that they don't want to work. Now, obviously, no one's a monolithic block. There's all kinds of people within any given
Mm,
population. But you feel that you've said to me that that broad brush is very unfair, that you have seen that there are a lot of people who do want to work and they just feel like they've been disenfranchised, that the government, the leadership classes, mainstream society, whatever you want to call it, has completely abandoned them. So I don't know if you had any thoughts to address
yeah.
anyone who might shoot back and say, well, these guys are just they have an entitled attitude and they just want to live off the government dole. I mean, again, I know that there's a
Yeah, I
mixture
mean,
of all types, but this is a sensitive, interesting topic to me as well.
I think the thing with me is that I've worked in charities and I've worked with a lot of and I've worked with a lot of people. So my opinions come from being on the ground and talking to people about their problems and their issues. I've come across people who have lost their family members in the most devastating ways and are still forced to go into work. And if they don't go into work, they lose their jobs. So I help within these charities try and get their jobs back for them or certainly get them compensated. And of course, when that kind of thing happens through these employment routes, they they do go into deeper depression. And there's all sorts of different circumstances that they are deliberately targeted. And I think that they are targeted because they do not know their rights and they do not know the law. And I think that that is why people are getting targeted to the extremes at which they are. And that's why I really hope that people will start learning the law and learning their rights, especially within employment and society as a whole.
I could see you being an evangelist and a leader. This is again what I was joking about with Rad Russ and No White Guilt the other day. This is the kind of thing that maybe in the future they will make movies about. Like we have Erin Brockovich, an American movie Julia Roberts played in, about how she took the legal system into her own hands. Obviously, Hollywood would not make your
No,
movie right now
too
because
racist.
it's too politically hot. And again, it's not
Yeah,
really
yeah.
racist in the way people understand that term, but
No.
that's how it's presented. That's how it's manipulated in people's minds. But this is why I say we need Vol Hollywood. We need our own kind of film industry telling stories like yours. I could see you because these girls from these communities, victims like Rotherham and Telford and all the others in the UK, a lot of them don't have the particular combination of traits that's needed to do what you did, to represent yourself, to do the research, to have the confidence and the articulation that you do. But I could see you leading these girls or helping teach others who can then represent them. Um, I mean, this is an
But I
amazing,
think
inspiring kind of thing.
I think also the problem is that the solicitors are not trying and testing new experiments within the legal system. They know what works, they know what makes profit, and you know law has become a corporation. It's not and commercialized. It's not about, people receiving justice anymore, and you have to ensure that you fight for that justice yourself, and you have to
In the
really
UK,
research.
mhm.
No, go on.
I was just going to ask, in the UK, am I right in saying you don't have a public representative the way you get assigned one in the UK? In the US, there are public
Oh,
defenders.
you you used to get legal aid, but that was taken away, I think, in 2012. We stopped receiving legal aid. So,
It's
that's
this
an
is fun.
issue for a lot.
This is funny to me because it's in the same breath as another question I wanted to ask you. From what you were saying about your charity work and helping with people who, let's say, they had an injury or a death in the immediate family, and they were forced to still work, and you were helping them through navigate situations related to that. Is we're told that the UK, especially again over here in the US, that we're told that it's a little bit more socialist, and there's you can debate the philosophies about the government there, and certainly on the whole, I'm not into giving the government too much power and say these mechanisms of charity can work through non-government agencies, but the government has to do something, and I do believe that it has to, in theory, protect its own people, of course, but without getting too far off track. We're told that it's socialist, like you guys have the national health services, and healthcare is paid for, and we debate things like that here in the United States. You're supposedly socialist, but you're telling me you don't get legal representation. What are you paying all those taxes
Mm.
for? Half your money in taxes. You're not getting legal representation. You can't take time off work if you're injured or you have some kind of family trauma. I mean, how do
Well,
you square that kind of thing?
legally you should get that time off, but I think because of 0 hours, because of the huge numbers of migrants and immigrants living here, there is always that ongoing fear and terror that you will lose all security, which you need to start a family, and you need to provide for your family. So I think that with all of these extra people living here, it's a huge concern for many people. So yeah, we live in this socialist. We do have many areas which are a socialist idea, I guess. But yeah, it doesn't extend to every part of the system. No, no, and yeah, you. This is why I'm deeply concerned about the legal system, and I would rather. I have been offered a job, but I would rather help people in a very serious sense with what they are facing, which is similar to my own um, experience, than get
It
paid huge amounts. I just the money means nothing to me. That's why I took the job on and this whole thing on, and I've recorded it because I want to make sure that these other girls can represent themselves and can fight for themselves.
Yeah, you've set precedent, and a lot of your audience
Yeah.
probably already knows, but just to reiterate, Social was actually offered a job at a solicitor's office, but it was very far away and might not work out personally. But just the fact that the job was offered is, again, a testament
Mm.
to the extraordinary work that you did, and you set legal precedent. Again, for our American viewers, there's common law in the UK. Well, now it's kind of usurped by the EU's laws, but they don't have a written
Mm.
constitution the way we do. They just have the whole accumulated history of legal precedents that
That's it.
solicitors and barristers then draw back on when addressing new cases. So, Social's case is now actually has set legal precedent in the United Kingdom, which means that it's on the record and that their solicitors or barristers, what we call lawyers here in the future, can look back to it and use the decisions and the judgments and the legalities associated with her case to argue future cases that are like that. So that's extraordinary. And what you were saying is that basically, with my whole question about socialism, is that again these things are theoretical. They're cherry picked. It's just like
Mm. Yeah.
freedom of speech. It's when it's convenient. And when it's shown
Yeah.
to be when it's convenient, it reveals the man behind the
Yeah.
curtain. It reveals the man behind the
Exactly.
curtain. It reveals the game. I feel like this is all Emperor's New Clothes kind of thing for anyone that knows that old folk tale. That we're seeing the Emperor's New Clothes and these politicians and this quote unquote leadership class. What I speak about often is this whole topsy turvy order that we live in, or lack of order that we live in right now. I know nothing's ever going to be perfect, and that every generation has to fight for their own version of justice and what's going on in the world at the time they live in. But just speaking very broadly, I feel like the middle class are so petrified because they're between upper classes and lower classes. And I wish people had a better sense of just we're all in this together. And people have different talents and different traits, and we all kind of play a role. That would be, to me, a more enlightened society. But the middle class is so damn petrified. They're so weak of wanting to act like they're not going to slip back into the lower classes and someone will mistake them for lower classes. So they have degrees and quote unquote sophisticated jobs in the city, and they feel very self satisfied about that. But that mentality, that managerial middling mentality, has now somehow taken over the upper echelons and the people who the halls of power that, again, in a cohesive, healthy society are supposed to be looking out for all the citizens, the whole body politic, all the different ways that everyone works together to form the society, is all out the window. Again, consider and remember what we spoke about with bringing in slave labor. We should call it the slave labor party in the United Kingdom, not the Labour Party, their leftist party. But again, this is happening under a conservative government. I mean, right now, Theresa May, the
Yeah.
government in there is conservative. It doesn't even really matter anymore. But my point is that that middling mentality of being so petrified that someone's going to mistake you for lower class because maybe you're a generation or two away from being your family being lower class yourself, and wanting to put on airs and appear that you're higher class than you are, I think that they have a hatred and they despise the lower classes, which to me is absolutely disgusting. They are selling
Well,
out their own people.
well, interestingly, I come from a middle class family, and my ex is working class, and I talk about the difference
Your
between the
ex is
two.
working class, yes.
Yeah, yeah, and I talk about the difference between the way he acts in society and the way my family acts, because there's an incredible difference. They're very much appeasing the middle class, is what I find, and they don't want to argue anything but someone else in authority or equal authority. So another professional might say within their work or anything like that. Whereas what I've noticed with many of the working class is that they will, they'll approach the subject. They won't be timid about the words that they use or anything. They'll go straight for it. And I wish that I could speak like those people, like my ex, and had the strength and the courage to be so blatant with my words. And I don't have that about me. And I've been raised in a very sort of politically correct environment, I guess. And I really admire that. I really wish that I had that about me. I really do.
Well, perhaps you're funneling it into your own version of it, because there certainly takes a lot of courage and fire to be doing what you're doing. So don't shortchange yourself. But for, again, anyone in listening who isn't aware of this story, Social's ex actually fought for her when they were trying to get the correct classification of her epilepsy, what we were talking about before.
Mm,
He wasn't quite satisfied with some of the things the doctors were saying. And he took that fire and that passion, and he actually made some changes. And she said, I love that you said this in your video when you mentioned him, that is very inspiring to me, that every man has his hero moment, or can have his hero moment throughout the course of his life. And that was one of them. I thought that was a beautiful moment of you talking about your ex. And it's great to hear that you guys have a relationship, even though you went your own ways in your personal life. So I think that
yeah. Yeah.
there's a lot to be said of how you handled that and how you speak about him right now. Um, there's related to this whole kind of thing. You also said that there are a lot of middle class people or what we might call in these states lower middle class. I don't know if you have as many delineations, and of course there are gradients. It's not quite an exact science, but a lot of the boomer generation are spending their savings that they haven't been wise with that they have lavished their own children and given a little, maybe made things too easy for their children, and that this is yet another symptom of this more selfish, atomized time that we live in. Again, this is why we have to keep having conversations like this, because everything is connected. Nothing is in a vacuum. But I remember saying
Yeah.
to you in a private conversation that there's this whole notion of, in Britain, the pensioners having to choose between heat or eat, that in the winter, sometimes people can't afford their grocery bills and their heating bills at the same time. Again, if you were so socialist, I don't really know why you have such high heating bills, but be that as it may, there are certainly people who are poorer who are having to make that legitimate choice. So I don't want to act like that's not going on. It certainly is. But you were saying that, again, for some people in that boat, they weren't really wise with their choices. That we, the boomers especially, were sold this whole notion of just living for today, being very selfish, wanting to lavish unearned lifestyles on their own children, and how that has to be considered amidst all of this as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's adverts, and I think that there is something happening with the banking system or something. I can't funding or something. I can't quite. I'm not very good with the economy and all of that kind of thing. But there's encouragement for the baby boomers who did have money to spend it, and that's what a lot of them did. And I know people and with a lot again with the appeasement which is going on, and the virtue signaling which is going on with the middle class. I know some who went and spent their money on handing it to people in Africa, and just handing it over to them, sending them thousands of pounds. And these weren't people who were tricked through the usual internet kind of scenario. These were people who just decided, yes, I'm going to send all my money to Africa, and then brag about it to other people within their community and their lifestyle. And yeah, and then their children, they're not providing their children. And of course, a lot of millennials are reliant on that money so that they can get on the housing ladder. And it's devastating to see how this is all about consumerism, of course, and globalism and all of that kind of thing. It's all related to that, but it's devastating to see that millennials are not able to get onto the housing ladder because of the way that their parents and baby boom generation are spending that excess money that they do have available. And of course, that's not everybody. Not everyone's fortunate enough to have middle class families, and I know a fair few, but it is a concern.
Yeah, it seems like living on credit and living above your means. Obviously, that's a
Mm.
tremendous thing here in the States, and maybe it's something we did more and even rubbed off on you. I don't know. I don't really know the timeline of that, but something in the zeitgeist, something in the age, in the certainly post Second World War and recent decades during our lifetime and our parents' lifetime, is somehow any sense of long term thinking has gone out the window. And again, as I've said, there's always ups and downs. There was never a perfect moment in history. There's always challenges. There's always fights. There's always positives and negatives. But to not think about the future, to not think about a long timeline, you're part of a story, you come from somewhere, your children and your grandchildren and great grandchildren are going to set something up. I know that on a basic family level, people still have those instincts. I'm not saying people don't love and care about their own children or grandchildren or whatnot, but those instincts have been perverted or usurped or muted in certain ways
Mm.
because they had to have been, when you look at the choices that people are making. what I was going to get at a moment ago with the whole, there's never been a perfect moment in history, but at least something for all ups and downs that people did possess in previous times and previous eras is that they felt more like they were part of a national project, that their nation was doing something and going somewhere. And this again relates to what I was saying about the middle class kind of hating the lower classes, and the upper classes who are supposed to be the elite leading classes kind of letting go of the reins or becoming debauched themselves. Whatever, all the different thousands of things that have gone on, both things we know about and things behind the scenes, the sum total of it is that we don't feel like, again, in our given nations, that we have this story, we have this national project. Sometimes here in the United States, we talk about the space race, and people could be cynical about that and talk about how we were trying to one up the communists, or it's always and only all about weaponry, and we want weapons in space so we can control everything. And I'm not saying that that's not true. So take what I'm saying, that example, maybe with a little bit of a grain of salt. But the overall point is that psychologically, for people to have a sense of purpose and they're part of something and they're moving somewhere, this is what, again, a side effect, the devastation of people living atomized, meaningless lives. We don't have a through line. We don't have something that we're looking towards. There's no national project.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I know you
Yeah. Go on.
go on.
After you. You were saying,
No, I was about to ask another question. So if you had something,
no, I don't. Go on.
the one other thing I would just say is, related to your family, you were saying you come from a middle class background, and it's fascinating that anyone that knows your story from some of the material you've shared, I know you've shared this publicly, so it's okay to say, is that you couldn't really even go to your own family for support, that they themselves
Mm,
were so enamored of political correctness or didn't want to touch it, that you being having done what was done to you because it was by the wrong kind of person and there are politically incorrect implications to it, that do you see what I'm talking to the audience now, do you see what I'm saying here, that political correctness has usurped a natural drive of a family to
yeah.
protect their own daughter, sister, whatever the case may be. I mean, you yourself say that you came from a leftist background, but I've listened to what you were saying about that, and you were talking more about you used to vote for you were anti-war, and you were voting against war.
Yes.
Or when you were a feminist, it was more about the fact that your family had some traditional elements where they would show you how to build furniture. You wanted to play the drums when you were a girl. So I would say, especially to some people, not that there's any excuse for this, but to people who have been trolly towards you, who have said horrible things like you deserved what happened to you. Um, Not that they should say that in any context, but just for clarification, if you really listen to Social's story, um, she wasn't like a blue-haired SJW type. Um, I just want to make
No.
sure that I don't want to speak for you, but I think
No,
I
no.
think I think a bit of clarification is needed there. I mean, you come from a traditional background. When you say feminist, you were using it in a very broad term. Um,
and 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 I say that I'm social justice, and I would agree with that. I do fight for a cause. I fight for for the rights of disabled people, and that means a lot to me. And people with mental health. When I work in my charities and everything, I'm dealing with men. I'm dealing with a lot of homeless men, and they are dealing with a lot of mental health issues. So yes, I am definitely on a fight and a cause for social justice, and that's from mental health and from disability point of view. But people have to remember that social justice covers a lot of areas. It doesn't just cover race, nationality, and gender. It does cover a large variety of large variations.
right, and this is why I talk about being careful about the terms, because it means something
Mm,
to you, of course, and what you're saying makes perfect sense. And that's great that you take your own experience and you care about mental health and you've dealt with your epilepsy and you're able to have that desire to help others. But the term social justice in the parlance today, that has a certain association for a lot of people, much like feminism. So, like I was saying, you mentioned feminism, and it was because you thought of yourself as kind of a quirky girl who wanted to play drums, which I thought was hysterical, and or you built furniture and you told these sweet stories about the men and women in your family working together. But when guys hear feminist, they're going to jump to a certain conclusion and think that you know your whole life was like anti-male, and it's anything but. If you listen to how you speak, and again what you said about your ex, and the things you said about his hero moment, no crazy feminist, what we think of as feminists, would say something like that. Or with social justice, yes, you're talking about justice in the original sense of the term as a virtue of wanting to right the wrongs and correct things and help people. Um,
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with that. But when we hear social justice, we often think most often of that, as I said at the beginning of our conversation now, that unfair fairness, that checkbox thing, which leads to things like pace, which leads to things like the police not stopping to help you because they don't want to arrest another Pakistani
And
guy
of
that month.
course, And of course, when I'm talking of social justice as well with regards to disability, I'm not talking about adding legislation. I'm talking about using existing legislation in a more cunning way, or thinking outside the box and using it in a way which other people haven't used it before. And of course, that's what I managed to do with regards to my own tribunal case. So, I don't think that we need to add legislation. I think we have good enough legislation. It's just that there's not that desire to experiment with that legislation because again, it's become corporate
Mm-hmm.
property.
On kind of that note, do you think there's like too much of an accumulation of law? I don't know if this is a bit of an on the
Yeah.
spot, question. I don't know if I'd be able to answer this, but do you think if something like Brexit went through, which I know might be a long, protracted process if it even happens, do you think it would behoove the United Kingdom to actually write a constitution? Does that leave open, or are there too many other groups there right now? See, as I'm asking you this question, I'm
Mm.
thinking there'd be Muslims involved in drafting that constitution,
Oh, I
right?
know, I know, I know that terrifies me. And the thing is, one of the good things about common law is that it evolves. It does evolve, and it is quite progressive in the fact that it evolves. But oh my goodness, I don't know. I wouldn't feel comfortable with a constitution because of the scenario that we could find ourselves in. Yeah, that's a deeply disturbing thought to me about Brexit. But I suppose we'd need the right government in to
Yeah,
protect.
there's a lot of factors to consider with that, and I know
It
you said
certainly is.
in the late '90s that EU law about minority status, and then it was developed even further in 2010. It kind of took top shelf over existing UK law, common law. But of course,
Mm.
the EU came about post World War II. Do you know anything about? I mean, I know this is going back a bit. If Britain was better off with just its own common law, when did EU law really begin to take over? I mean, obviously the EU was in place for a while, and Britain wasn't involved at first, as far as I
Mm.
know. But it does seem like things really, really ramped up in the 90s. But obviously, the EU had
Now,
existed for decades prior to the 1990s. So I don't really, I'm just kind of thinking out loud. I'm not really
yeah,
aware, except to do more research.
interestingly, I think the Equality Act is when everything started. Well, the Human Rights Act is when everything started changing, and then with that, we got the Equality Act in 2010. Now, there's a on page 4 of the Equality Act. It says complying with the equality duty may involve treating some people better than others as far as this is allowed by discrimination law, which is deeply concerning when you think about minorities and what's going on with the grooming gangs. And this extends, I think that there's Schedule 11 or Schedule 9 within the Equality Act, and it explains who this applies to. It even applies, would you believe it, to the secret intelligence service. And that will be with regards to terrorism. Now, that's really disturbing with what's going on, like we were talking at the very beginning, with regards to Lawrence Southern and also the upcoming possible law on watching terrorism programs or videos on the internet. And sorry, I've completely gone off track there, but
No, it's the recording of this stream may be illegal soon in the United Kingdom.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, with regards to the EU, I think that Human Rights Act came in 1998. Now I've just come across a news article. I'll try and find it. I think it's on my phone.
And this was the
And
Blair had just gotten in, so this was the Blair Labor
yeah,
government, and they were set up to just fully
now
let the
this
EU human rights laws start being enacted more strongly,
I
more
really
stringently in the United Kingdom.
Now, I really encourage people to take a look at this website. It's called standpointmag.co.uk. And the title of the article is Criminal Gangs, Girls, and Grooming the Truth. And this was written up in 2010. Now, what it talks about in this article is that in 2004, Channel 4 did a video or did a documentary on the grooming gangs, on the Asian men grooming gang of white girls, and it was prevented from going out because we had EU and local elections coming up at that point. Can you believe it? So they knew about this. So the documentary was made in 2004, which means that the investigation would have been done around about 2002 or 2003, which is very close to the Human Rights Act coming in 1998.
Yeah. So you get the
Um,
impression they knew what they were doing, and it was rolled out quickly once these things
yeah,
were put into place.
yeah.
And then
I'm still investigating it.
concurrently they were basically going and finding and inviting people from other areas of the world
Yeah.
in. So again,
Mm,
it's
mm.
I only have so many hours in my day and so many things I could be interested in. I'm not huge into conspiracies, but just because something's going on behind the scenes or there's nefarious objectives or motives that aren't out in the public, it doesn't mean something's not legitimate. I mean, if you look at the results of what's happening, I don't know how at this point in my life, from what I know, that I can't say that there is a concerted effort to chip away at what we know and love of Western European civilization. There's something,
Yeah.
there's something going
And
on,
of course, in the
obviously.
UK in the UK in the 1970s and ongoing really, and probably before then, we had a huge issue with the establishment molesting and raping, little boys
Yes, and
from
that's something
schools.
you talk about as well, just to connect it to your personal story.
Yeah,
Again, to clarify for some people in the audience, when you say when you used the term that you were a feminist, you meant it more from this angle, that you saw the Jimmy Savile story,
yeah.
the radio and TV personality who had been abusing children for years, and you saw that come out, and that it was covered up. It's
Mm,
more in the same breath that you're saying that you want to protect these young girls. I mean, hell, I'll call myself a feminist if that's what feminist meant. So let's just be very
yeah,
clear about
yeah.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. I
But
mean,
I think,
I've always been anti-establishment since childhood. As soon as that stuff came out with Jimmy Savile, and I learned about that, anti-establishment and anti anything which the establishment seems to direct you to, seem to be directing you in.
yeah. For any American who may not know this, of course, when Social said Asian a couple of moments ago, in you know popular language in the UK, they mean Pakistani, Middle Eastern. We Americans, of course, when we hear Asian, we think more of East Asian, Chinese, Japanese, Korean. Also, there's an article. It was brought to my attention by a YouTube channel, Semiagog. This guy Oliver Perrin, who has Semiagog, Semiogogue. He just did a video about the subjects of the UK are not free or something like that, talking about, again, the Lauren Southern, Brittany Pettibone, Martin Sellner situation, specifically that Lauren Southern is a Canadian citizen. So that's still part of the Commonwealth and still,
Mm,
I mean, am I saying this correctly? She would still be considered a subject of the crown. He
yeah.
just did a video based on a blog, a long blog post by a guy named Preston Byrne, Byrne, that compares UK laws and US laws. So, look, I'm a big critic of American imperialism and American consumerism. America's a big place and there's a lot going on and there's a lot of different strands to American history. So you can be grown up about it and criticize a lot of aspects of America. But for anyone out there who thinks, paints too broad a brush with that, if you're an American, this will make you appreciate some of the freedoms we have here and what we cannot take for granted. And in a longer term vision and longer term thinking, what's propelling me, and this might be lifetime projects and intergenerational projects, a big meta question to me is how do we learn from each other? How can we form civilizations and societies that combine the American freedom and entrepreneurial spirit with the European beauty and connection to roots? I think that that's just a question we need to keep asking ourselves and keep exploring. But I think this has been an amazing conversation, as I had no
Yeah.
doubt it would be. I don't know, Social, if you had any other points or any questions before we wrap up.
No, I think that that's enough for me. And I do advise everyone to have a look at your website. It's thegreatorder.com, isn't it? And
The
it's
Great
a
Order.
great
Yeah,
website.
you cut out for a minute. Yes, thegreatorder.com.
Yeah, yeah. So please go and visit his website. He's got t-shirts on there. Very fantastic. I love them.
It's funny. Those T-shirts they're like memes on a T-shirt,
Yeah,
and
they're fantastic.
I know some of them. It's like I have to be perfectly honest, and I've been thinking about this. Um, I've always kind of liked the idea of T-shirt design, and it kind of came naturally to do them when I was starting my website. And I don't want it to seem like I'm trying to profit off of crazy situations or people in who are suffering real crimes like yourself. Like I have a shirt that says "God Save Britain" or "Save Sweden" or "Save
Yeah,
Germany,"
I saw
and
that. Yeah.
I have a shirt with Merkel that says "traitor" on it. That doesn't really fit into what I'm saying. There's a lot of different ones. There's like 20 different designs.
Oh, it's
But
brilliant.
the
They're
but the
brilliant.
ones that are more like "Save Germany," "Save Sweden," again, I on the one hand, I don't want it to be like I'm trying to make a buck off of these crazy situations. It's more to raise awareness. Some of the T-shirts I know, especially if you were to wear them over there in Europe, it might be dangerous. So some of them I know
Yeah,
might not be huge sellers. It's more just so that when people see them, it still kind of sparks something in them. Like, oh, there's a T-shirt out there that says that. Why does it say that? Maybe they'll dig a little deeper. So some of the T-shirts more than others are kind of trolly. Like I know that they might not sell a lot. I know that they might literally be dangerous to wear in some places, but that alone should tell you something. So some of them are just exist to spark
you know,
thought and reflection to
you
tell you
know,
tell you the truth.
you should make one so that we can wear it in Britain called "Russia Did It."
Well, you could wear that all day long.
Then that
Russia
won't
did.
be hate speech.
Russia did everything. In fact, we have confirmed that some of the technical difficulties that made us start about 20 minutes late was in fact the
Well,
Russians.
yeah,
It was the Russians today,
we,
folks. You heard it here
we did
first.
discuss that. Yeah, yeah. And yeah, sorry, just one thing. The formula on the Russia incident that's happened. It's actually available on something called the World Wide Web. Did you know that?
The formula? What do you mean? The formula for Russia? I'm not.
Yeah. Do you know about the Salisbury incident?
The you cut out again. The spy
This,
incident that just happened.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm aware that there was a double agent and that he's dead now. I'm aware of that.
Yeah, the formula is written in a book which is available on the World Wide Web.
Okay, we'll talk more.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll talk more about this
We'll talk about
off
hate. Yeah.
air.
Yes. No hate speech here. Yeah,
All
I
right.
think
Well,
we've come to the end.
thank you for having me on your channel. As I said, I appreciate your work, and I know this won't be the last time that we've spoken, nor will speak,
Yeah,
I should
yeah,
say.
yeah, yeah. And as always, I really enjoyed my conversation with you. It's been lovely.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And bye.